initiative and recall legislation brought in by the NDPs in 2006, was it?
Well,
No,
it was
96.
1996. It was leftover from the Socred era.
That's right. And they legislated this initiative and recall. And what do you think about it? I understand you don't like referenda. Do you like recall?
I don't like this legislation. I think it's designed to fail. And I think it's, again, not used for the purpose that I think recall should be. I certainly support recall. But I think it should be not a redoing of an election. I think it should be related to people who are engaged in unethical behavior or who are misusing the funds of the people of British Columbia. So I have similar opinion on recall legislation. I think that it's a very blunt instrument, and I don't think it necessarily gets us a better democracy.
So who will decide on what is appropriate to call for recall or not to call? You said in some cases of some issues, MLAs should be recalled, but in some others they shouldn't. Who will decide what is appropriate? I mean, the opposition will always call for recall and defend the right to recall. And the defenders of that party or that MLA will say, no, that's not a good reason. How do we define what is a good reason? When I go to vote for you, does anybody come to me and say, what's the reason for voting for James Derry? Nobody asks me that. I just go and I say, if I could be right or wrong, I'll just vote for you. When I want to take my vote out and vote for somebody else because I got disenchanted with you, for instance, who will come and say, well, your reasons are not good enough?
Well, if we wanted to reform the recall and initiative legislation, it would depend on the government in power deciding that they wanted to do that. And I can tell you that neither the NDP nor the Liberals will ever reform that legislation.
How about the Greens?
The Green Party would reform it if we get into government. We're not going to be in government. We're going to be in opposition. We're going to be a very small group of MLAs. And quite frankly, there are things that are so serious that we need to deal with: the climate crisis, the crisis in the delivery of our social services, the crisis in our democracy, that for me would come way ahead of wanting to spend time proposing reform of that piece of legislation.
But if you could reform, how would you reform it? What would be the reform that you would advocate for recall and initiative?
Well, I would have to think about that. I would have to go to people and say, you know, how would this work for you? I personally believe that when you have recall legislation, you should have very clear criteria that you would use in order to say that a recall is a legitimate thing to be engaged in doing. If we were to have recall legislation, I think it would need to be reformed so people could actually be successful in the recall. And right now, the legislation is designed so that nobody can be successful. Nobody can be successful.
Why is that people are not successful?
Because the bar is too high, the time is too short, the number of people that you have to contact, you have to use the past existing voters list. I mean, it's all designed to not work in the best interests of what citizens might want.
So the bar right now is 40%. They want 40% of the registered voters to come and say, we don't want this MLA anymore.
Right.
Would you lower that bar?
Yes, it would seem that we want to lower it.
To
But
how low?
we're talking two different things. I don't think that recall or initiative are strategies for reforming our democracy. I think the strategy for reforming our democracy are way better than that, way bigger than that. That is a very blunt instrument, and again, it divides people. It doesn't unite us around the issues that we need to pay attention to.
So your suggestion is that to use consensus instead of referendum?
That's right.
And definition of consensus is exactly what?
Consensus is when the broadly based majority of people that are dealing with an issue decide on a certain course of action.
And how do you measure that broadly based consensus? How do you measure?
Well, I would measure it like they did at the Citizens Assembly, where 140 people of 170 said, this is what we think is the best course of action.
It's not any different than referenda?
It's way different. 50% plus one
Okay.
versus 80 or 85 or 90%. That for me is the difference.
Well, the 50 plus 1 is the minimum, but it doesn't mean that 90% cannot be in consensus of it. So
It does, because referendums will never achieve 90% because they tend to divide people into two groups. And they tend to be within that margin between 50 and 60%. That's why the BC Liberals and the BC NDP set the bar for electoral reform at 60%, because it is rare that any referendum or any vote that the people make can exceed that 60%. It's not a thing that's designed to get us to work together as a people to find ways that we can feel good about what we're doing.
all right. The NDPs in 1996 brought a legislation called Recall and Initiative. What do you think about that legislation? You think it's a good legislation, or should we enhance it, or should we dismiss it, or what do you think about that legislation?
To be honest, I know of the legislation. I do not know the wording. I realize what they're trying to do is if a person is elected and the people do not think they're doing their job properly, or there's something that comes forward that people weren't happy about, then they have a chance to recall that person. So in theory, it's having the election over again, and they're saying, we don't want this person. Let's vote on him again, and that could fail, and the person stays, or that new vote, in theory, could have that person be taken away from, lose the position that they ran for. So it's just a re-vote of the vote because people have changed their minds somewhat.
Right.
I don't know the total wording of the act, so I don't know what it is, but the intent.
You think that people should have the right to call for another election 6 months down the road? You're elected now and you're deciding on some legislation that the majority of people, or apparently the majority of people, don't want it. Do you think they should have the right to recall you?
It's a challenge.
Yeah.
Again, elections are expensive, and if you go through an election, like I was the candidate in September, so I've been running for 8 months now. People know my stand, they know where I sit, my positions on things. So if I get elected and they don't like me the next month, then I think it's superfluous to waste a vote saying, now we don't want him in. Democracy has to be responsibility of the people to make sure the views are heard, but also it cannot be something that's just done willy-nilly just because they don't like something the person's done the next day, because we're only in for a 4-year term. So
yeah, I know. Suppose I voted for you.
Okay.
And 3 months down the road, I find that you're voting for legislation that I completely oppose. So I don't want you to represent me specifically in that legislation. So I want to change my vote to some other independent or other party. Should I have the right to recall you?
Again, there's 45, 50,000 people in that riding. If they all feel the same way, then I guess so. You'll never get that kind of consensus, because I find hard getting that on the doorstep when I try to do my views, and we will never always agree on the same things. You and I could agree on what we want for economic development in the province, and we could agree on 9 out of 10, but on the 10th we're not going to. And if that's strong enough for you, then you have to do what you think. But you got to realize it's a big process, and you got to be fair and realize that as long as the bulk of the people, which is democracy, the bulk of the people's needs are being met, then that's right.
Right. The bulk, you mean the majority?
The majority of the people, because that's democracy. Democracy is for the betterment of all the people within that social network, whether it's a riding or a province.
So if the majority of people decide to depose you from being an MLA, you would accept that?
Yes.
Good. Well, I wish you well, Chris, and thank you for coming.
Thank you. It's been nice talking to you.
The last question here is, how do you like the legislation of recall and referendum that the NDPs brought in 1996? Do you think that we should enhance it, or we should dismiss it, or is it okay the way it is, almost irrelevant?
Well, we have seen some initiatives and some recalls, so it is that's encouraging.
Trying to recall, I don't
Trying
think
to recall is very difficult.
not one really succeeded.
No one has succeeded yet. The only
getting the 40%,
initiative
yeah.
is the HST that has succeeded.
Initiative, yes.
And
What would be the threshold in your opinion?
sorry, I'm not going to make up a number out of my head. I don't have a number for that.
But it should be lower, you said.
Yes, it should be easier to get those things started. On a recall petition is essentially asking for another vote. And so if, I believe it's right now, 10% of the voters have to sign a petition.
No, 40%.
40% of the voters have to sign to trigger a vote.
That's right.
I think that's far too high.
Yeah. So
I
you would
think
lower it, at least you would
well,
lower
especially because we're only getting, 55% of
turnout.
turnout.
Yeah.
That's saying over half of the people who turned out have to want the election replayed.
So you would
not
lower
gonna
it
work.
to some other number, lower than 40 anyway.
I was surprised it wasn't 10%.
No, the initiative is 10%.
Okay, the initiative is 10%.
The
yeah,
recall is 40%.
yeah, and that triggers another election.
Right,
So
right.
the threshold should be lower than that.
Okay. And how would you create a mechanism to register, to make it easier for that legislation to people, so where people can go and participate? Like, we don't have a real easy mechanism. Say you go to a library and you pull a file and you put in an initiative.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have that mechanism. Do you think you would work on something like that?
Yeah, we need mechanisms. We need to use the internet. It's it's there for that purpose. It's the people's communication at this point. So that sort of thing should be made possible.
So you're not afraid of being recalled?
No, I'm not.
Good. You
if I'm-
want the will of the people to prevail.
Well, I want the people to be able to tell me loud and clear if they don't think that I'm representing them fairly.
Okay.
I have a code of representative conduct as a Green MLA, or MLA candidate,
Yeah,
and that
yeah.
specifically states that my first priority is to represent my constituents,
Okay.
and that's my first loyalty, not the party. So if I'm not doing a good job, I really want to hear about it before election time.
Right, right. How about after election time?
Well, if I win the election, I want to hear in the middle of my term. If I'm elected, I want to hear regularly from my voters. I will be doing town halls
Right.
and publicizing them widely and using the internet as well as in-person and telephone communication to make sure I'm still in contact with everybody in between elections.
Between elections. Good. Well, I wish you well, Suzanne. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
coming. Let me ask you the last question here is
Yes.
about your recall and referendum that
Mhm.
Ujaldo signed back in 1996.
Yep.
And some people think that doesn't work because the threshold of triggering a recall is too high. What is your opinion? Should we change it, make it easier, make it simpler, or we should just dismiss it because it's not a good legislation as some people think?
I think referendum has its place, and we certainly saw that with the HST, that the public had a voice, they had a say to be able to utilize that legislation. I think it is very serious, and so I think having a high threshold is important because I think it is a very serious question. I'm not a believer that you send everything to referendum or plebiscite, or
Like
I
what,
think there
what
are.
would you send
Well,
to
I'll
referendum?
use the example of California, where in California you have proposition approach.
Taxes, yeah.
And in proposition approach, you can say nay to providing education dollars, for
It was
example.
for taxes.
That's
yeah.
right, for taxes to pay for education.
That's right, yeah.
That can be turned down by a majority who may not have kids in school, who think they've already had the opportunity to be educated. There are services, I believe, that are important for the good of society, education, healthcare. You wouldn't put, should we provide healthcare for our seniors, to referendum. That's something a society should do. So I think there's some big issues that are part of what government should do
Are
that
you-
shouldn't be going to referendum.
Are you afraid that most people would turn down providing for seniors?
No, not at all.
I think most
but
people would.
But I've seen it in education.
support.
I've seen many people in education who say, I no longer have children in school, so I don't want to pay my school taxes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I believe education benefits everyone, regardless of whether you have children in school or not.
Would you have a plebiscite on education and say it's not binding, but we just want to find out, in fact, because I believe that that's not true. That's my gut belief that most people, even if they don't have kids, they say, yeah, but I did have, or my sister has kids, or my neighbor has kids. And most people are rational enough to say, no, we have to pay taxes.
I've sadly seen jurisdictions where that hasn't occurred, and I wouldn't want to put the future of our children and the future of our education system to the whim of what may
Majority
occur.
of
That's what I
people,
would
that
worry.
could be
That
wrong.
would be my worry,
Yeah,
is for
yeah.
basic services. But
Yeah.
I think for other questions and for discussion points and for issues that should be discussed, those are exactly the issues.
Some things can be put to plebiscite and referendum, and there are other things that should stay out of the table.
That's right. That's right. Things that are basic laws and basic human rights, basic minority rights, are just things that society should do. But engaging the public more, and I think that's my focus would be, how do we engage the public more, whether it's a plebiscite, whether it's referendum, whether it's use of legislative committees, whether it's more engagement by all politicians. That's nothing but positive for democracy. That's nothing but positive for democracy.
Even if you lose some of your power as to
Oh
make
yes,
decisions.
from my
by
perspective,
giving.
the public should be the ones who are in power anyway. They're the
Okay.
ones who elect us. I'm not here to represent myself or my political party. I am elected to represent the public.
And if 6 months later after you get elected,
Yep.
some people say, let's recall Carol James.
Yes.
We don't like her anymore.
They have every
Would-
right to do that.
You would support that.
They have every right to do that.
And how about the 40% threshold? Is it the
you
right
need,
level?
Yeah, I think you need to have a serious threshold. I think you can't look at lowering down the thresholds. I think you need a high threshold for very serious
So 40%
opportunities.
is good. good.
The existing legislation, from my perspective, doesn't need to be changed.
Because otherwise people would be too frivolous and saying
Yeah, I
I
think you
just...
can't. Well, they might want to refight the election. It might just be a basic, let's refight the election, and then you're constantly in dealing with recall. That's not what the recall is meant for. The recall is meant for someone who does something that is so egregious that it was time for them to be recalled.
Right.
But, you know, I feel in my job, whether it's being out in my neighborhood, whether it's at the grocery store, I'm accountable every single day to the public.
Carol, when I vote for you, nobody asked me, what is your reason? Is it morally justifiable or good enough? I just said, you want to vote for Carol, you vote for Carol.
Yes.
When I want to call it back,
Yeah.
now you're saying it needs to be a serious
Yes.
reason.
Yes.
Why is that difference that when I give you my vote, there is no conditions, but when I want to take it back, there's a condition?
Well,
Why?
because I think elections and democracy are part of a very important part of our society. And when you have an election, everybody has the opportunity to vote. Everybody has the opportunity to engage. In a recall, you can have particular interests that may, as I talked earlier about the minority versus majority voices. Elections are an opportunity for the majority to be engaged and involved. So the day after an election is the day to continue to be accountable to your constituents.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. It was a
I
great
wish you well.
conversation. Thank you very much.
You know, in 1996, the NDPs brought a legislation called Recall and Initiative and Recall. Do you think that law should be reformed to make it easier, or you think that it's not necessary because it hasn't really been used?
Right.
It's there in theory, but in practice, it's hardly used. So, what do you think about that legislation?
I would definitely have to look at it further.
Okay, so you're not sure whether it should be changed
Yeah.
because you haven't looked at it. Okay, well, that's all I wanted to ask you.
Well, thank you very much for
and-
having me.